Hello and good morning. So, are you somebody that absolutely loved the hell out of Final Fantasy Tactics? Perhaps you heard of the Tactics Ogre One Vision mod? Or recommended to, maybe go give it a little bit of a try. And your first thought was, oh god, what do I do? There's all these bajillion classes. I don't recognize any of these. Well, no worries, because you know what? All these are actually a lot more similar than you may think. Now, first of all, I should point out, this is, as I was saying earlier, for the One Vision mod. Now, in my personal opinion, this is hands down the way to experience Tactics Ogre Let Us Cling Together, so if you haven't tried out the mod, please go ahead and do so. This will be assuming that you have made the correct choice and gone ahead and given this mod a little bit of a try. So first of all, let's go down the list here. Now, your warrior. You may be thinking, yes, this is the basic class, this must be like the squire, and not exactly. Funnily enough, if you've played War of the Lions, the warrior is actually a lot more similar to the Onion Knight in this particular instance, in that they are essentially your everyman weapon master kind of guy. Essentially, they specialize in equipping whatever weapons you really want them to. They actually can equip everything short of spell books and instruments. Now, in case you're unfamiliar with the array of weapons available in Tactics Ogre, you basically have dang near anything you can possibly think of. Fists, daggers, one-handed swords, two-handed swords, of both Western and Eastern varieties. You got various types of polearms and axes and hammers and bows and crossbows and whatever. Even guns. I mean, it's all in here. It's friggin' all in here. Don't worry about it. Anything you want, it's got, like this game, this mod, whatever. It's all in here. So, Basic Warrior, very similar to the Onion Knight, as it should be. Essentially, this is a class that functions in a way that allows you to train them in just about any weapon possible. This is just something that's particularly useful if, for example, you want to build somebody towards a particular thing later. Like, let's say, you want to have him go be a good Dragoon down the line, and you want him to train in spears. You can go ahead and do that. You want him to be a good sword master down the line. You go ahead and have them train in two-handed katanas or maybe two-handed swords, or just frankly any type of sword, because sword masters can just do all of it. And yeah, they're pretty darn nifty. So personally, I just love the simplicity of the idea. Alright, next up, the Archer. This actually functions very similarly to how they do in FFT, however they are given a crapload more range and a little bit more options in terms of their weaponry. So you have both one-handed and two-handed bows and crossbows that are available to these guys, as well as daggers and light shields if you want to go that route. So similar to how they did it in FFT, if you want to go crossbow and shield, that is actually a perfectly viable strategy, and I will say that crossbows are way better in this game. They aren't just something to throw out a debuff. They are actually there as a primary weapon. So if you're going for, say, a light shield and a crossbow, they can be very evasive. If you want to have a short bow and a shield, that's an option as well. If you want to just specialize in really long range, you can go for a longbow or even a siege bow, which extends their range even farther. You've got various types of crossbows, from your basic heavy crossbows to your, as I like to call them, railgun crossbows with their obscene range. They have a lot more options. Now, instead of your charge abilities, though, you actually just have an ability called Tremendous Shot, which guarantees a crit on your next shot, as well as giving a 100% chance to hit. So this is essentially a mix of your charge ability, plus your ability to have Concentrate for one turn, and essentially allows you to ignore things like, for example, rain is a pretty big factor. Normally you see decreases of about 20 to 30% accuracy, so this allows these guys to just shoot straight through the rain. Their overall power isn't something hugely amazing, but still very handy. Moving right along here, we got the Wizard. As you might expect, this is basically as close as you're going to get to your standard Black Mage type counterpart. However, they also get access to things like daggers, so if you want to have them literally run up and just shank a guy and have him stuck there in place, there are basic daggers that allow you to basically do the equivalent of a don't move action on somebody, so that's very handy to have. These guys are able to use all of the basic missile abilities, your basic like area of effect boom type abilities, as well as a few useful buffs as well. So for example, things like Grace, which will be out of the magic tree that allows you to give an evasion buff to everybody that's around. It's very handy to have. So overall, these guys are your basic caster type. They also specialize in being very long range. So they have an ability they get early on that allows them to extend their firing range by 3 extra tiles, meaning they can be well out of range of anybody actually countering whatever they do. So that's potentially very handy. Moving on here, we have the Cleric, as you might expect. These are your White Mage counterpart. However, a few little things that you might see different on this guy. Even though their heals are amazing, they are still instant, like just about everything in this game. But you actually don't have the ability to revive anymore with this mod. So essentially, they're able to evacuate downed units, which essentially allows them to leave without dying. You may notice the heart counter at the very top there. That's basically how many lives somebody has. As soon as those disappear, they are dead. So that's basically how that goes. As far as their healing abilities, they are absolutely fantastic, and unlike the FFT White Monks or White Mages or any of that, you can think of these guys as a little bit of a combination of the Monk and the White Mage, mostly because they're able to specialize, they're able to equip evasion-based equipment as well as a fist weapon, which essentially allows them to stand in the front row, essentially dodge attacks, and punch out with these poisoned claws that essentially allow them to spread out poison and damage over time while healing their own guys. It's very handy. So essentially that's the best way I would put that one. They're not exactly a one-to-one with a monk, but the fact that they end up fighting with their fists just brings that to mind for me every single time. Actually, the female version of this is even called the monk. Now, moving on, we have the Spellblade. This one is a little bit hard to place in terms of comparing it to FFT. I would say arguably the closest would be something like the Mystic, but these guys are essentially going to specialize in buffing their fellow soldiers and things like that. For example, they have an ability that allows them to have a 100% hit chance for everybody within a small local AoE type area. On top of that, they get a bunch of buffs on them as well. So, for example, each weapon in this game, almost each weapon, I should say, has a chance to do something else on top of their basic ability. So, for example, an axe has a chance to inflict the breached, which is a defense lowering type thing. And so, for example, with these guys, if they use their ability, that will be 100% for one turn. So they'll essentially always be able to get that secondary effect. So that's very handy. They can do that for a whole bunch of units, so they're there for passively kind of buffing your other units. They're very useful if you want to make your leader into one. Essentially, they can just be passing out all these buffs while staying in relative safety. On top of that, they're able to heal themselves instantly with all of their accumulated TP, which is kind of like an adrenaline type system. And yeah, overall, very versatile. They've got a lot of different options. Probably the closest thing would be the Mystic. Now, next we have the Knight. Interestingly enough, this Knight is not exactly going to be the same as the FFT Knight, not even by a remotely long shot. So the FFT Knights specialized in doing various debuffs, destroying equipment, all that sort of thing. These Knights actually specialize in holding front lines. So I would describe these guys as a Guardian unit, much more similar to FFTA's Paladin. So basically just kind of like a guardsman type of character. So essentially they specialize in just forming a front line. They're able to essentially put fake clones of themselves to just create a massive wall to block an entire area off. However, if you're looking for an actual equivalent and or similar type situation to your original knight, that would be the Terror Knight here. So they specialize in two-handed weapons of various types. So while, for example, the knight gets like one-handed swords and a shield, one-handed spears, one-handed axes, hammers, etc., these guys specialize in the two-handed versions of all these things. They're going to get access to the heavy variants of swords, and on top of that, they're able to do lots of debuffs just to kind of support their abilities from the front row. Both of these guys are very similar in terms of in terms of their general tankiness. Just these guys are better for area control. These guys are better for overall pressure. And yeah, they actually make a very interesting team here, because these guys can put down these fake clones of themselves, whereas these guys can blow them up and do a bunch of damage to everybody nearby, so that's all handy. Now, next, we got the Berserker here. So, I would argue in many ways that the Berserker is probably what remains of the Monk from FFT. Now, why do I say this? Well, essentially this is because they're able to, once again, have fist weapons and hit in an AoE type area. So these guys specialize in essentially trading their health away for being able to go and do all kinds of different things. I guess in many ways a little bit of an opposite to the FFT monk in that way, but they're essentially able to sacrifice some health to make themselves stronger. They can sacrifice some health to charge their TP bar, which essentially allows them to use things like kill moves, essentially allows them to use more abilities. They're able to use Berserk, which will let them hit in a 5-tile area in front of them, just kind of in an arc, and that can be absolutely devastating if used right. Especially, there's actually one character that you can get on the neutral route that can be a flying berserker, and oh my goodness, that guy is ridiculously good. So there we go. So that's the berserker for you. You can go double fist weapons on them if that's your thing. I mean, you can go like fist weapon axe on them. You can just go heavy axes and hammers. You can just go shield and fist. Personally, I like using heavy axes on these guys, but that's entirely up to you. They have a ton of different weapon options. Next up, we have the Swordmaster. So, interestingly enough, despite the fact that there is a ninja in this, I would say that the Swordmaster is actually the closest thing to FFT's ninja in this game. Mostly because they specialize in damage, they specialize in evasion, and on top of that, they can actually attack before the other guy, which you actually see the AI utilizing a couple times. Now, they do have the ability to dual wield different types of swords. So, for example, if you want Western swords or Eastern swords, or you want the heavier variants of both of them, they've got all of it. They've got very early access to double attack, so these guys are going to be very handy for that. On top of that, unlike the ninjas here, they're actually able to hold their own in the front line, just like FFT's ninjas were able to. They can put out a fair bit of damage, and on top of that, they've got a few buffs that allow them to boost all of these. Either boost stats or do a relative area of effect type heal. This is in many ways a combination of what would essentially be the samurai as well as the ninja from FFT. Including, if you end up going for a two-handed katana on these guys, there is a version of those that essentially have the draw out ability, which will essentially allow them to hit in an area of effect type situation around them, as well as all their dance moves essentially functioning very similar to the draw out abilities from FFT without actually losing a lot of without actually losing those weapons. So don't worry. Their stuff isn't breaking. Apparently they made it far more durable this time around. So there's that. Alright, next up, we have the Dragoon. I don't think this one actually has an FFT variant. This is essentially a guy that has been very prevalent in the Tactics Ogre series. Essentially, they were originally kind of like a champion knight type situation, but in this game they are essentially an anti-monster unit. They're especially dedicated to just do crap loads of damage against beasts and dragons. So they're essentially your anti-tank, as it were. Very, very handy to have. Personally, I like keeping one of them around. Obviously, people's mileage might vary. They might see, about replacing the regular knights with these guys. That's up to you. Personally, I just like keeping one around as a bit of a specialist role. Like I said, that's up to you. Alright, next up we have the Ninja. Now, if you think that this compares with the Ninja in FFT, it's a little bit of a trickier type situation. They do still have access to double attack, so yes, so far that is 3 separate classes that have access to double attack. But anyhow, they all have double attack for different reasons. For example, the Berserker is all about doing crazy amounts of damage, so that's his whole deal. He's going to do a lot more damage with it. The Swordmaster is about getting a bunch of hits in quickly, which they specialize in doing that way. The Ninja, however, cannot equip shields. So in many ways, they are essentially just trying to, kill something before it has a chance to move. Now, personally, the way I like doing these guys is just giving them, like, let's say, a dagger and a sword, essentially, hopefully getting a bind attack off on somebody, and then using their special ability, which is a sleep bomb, to immediately follow that up with the ability to have a 60% chance to put anything that is not immune to sleep. So, it's very handy to have. But again, it's not exactly the FFT ninja. They have casting abilities, so they've got some magic abilities. They're actually surprisingly strong in that regard. But yeah, by and large, they specialize in debuffs and actual, mostly spy type work and shutting down of squishies and like the far flanks of the map and that sort of thing. So I guess it all depends on how you use your ninjas in FFT, but by and large, these are more of a spy and assassination type setup. Alright, next up we have the Rogue. Now, as far as an FFT equivalent for this one, it's a little hard to say, but I would argue... This is going to be a little bit of a weird one, but I would say arguably something like the Mime. Now, why the hell would I say the Mime? Well, it's mostly because you are in many ways trying to trick somebody into essentially making use of those same abilities. Not to mention the Rogue has access to a bunch of stuff that they technically shouldn't have access to. So, for example, through their traps, they're able to use a bunch of buffs and debuffs, a much wider variety than almost any other classes available to them. For example, an ability called Ivory Tower, which can make somebody completely immune to an attack for one turn, or you've got another one that will remove a unit's health and cause them to be stuck in place for a long time, or another one that will do a ton of damage and cause them to be charmed at the same time. They get access to possibly the widest range of different debuffs available in this mod. And yeah, absolutely fantastic class. Basically can use them for either ranged or close range type stuff. It's really just up to you. But it's hard to say. I mean, arguably some Geomancer in this one maybe. Interestingly enough, the creator of this mod was planning a way to try and make a Geomancer type setup happen. But anyway, that's kind of how it is. I should probably note by this point, I was mentioning this Spellblade up here earlier. In case you were wondering, there's actually a few units, namely the Spellblade, I believe the Necromancer, and then the Warlock, who actually have access to the old FFT Chemist ability to throw items innately. And on top of that, almost anybody can actually equip an item called the Lobber, which will essentially make them into a chemist right off the bat. It'll allow them to throw items at a pretty significant range, and on top of that, I will, well, it should be noted that they actually should be able... They're only able to use that as long as they have Field Alchemy equipped. Probably should have let off with that. It's one of their 10 skill slots. So either way, not a huge commitment to that. Odds are you should have Field Alchemy on everyone anyway. But that's just something to throw out there. Now, why am I mentioning that? Well, that's because the next one is the Fusilli Err. So this guy is actually available way later in the game, actually arguably a little bit later than he should be. But anyhow, this is a class that specializes in guns. To start off with, they only get access to daggers and crossbows, but later on they get access to pistols and rifles. Now, they're a class that, if I were to say a similarity thing here, I would oddly say the Negotiator or the Orator, whatever you want to call them. Now, why on earth would I say that? Well, that's because their kill moves, and a lot of with their kill moves, this game essentially has a system where once one of your meters reaches a certain point, they're able to do a special move. In this case, with the Fusiliers, they have essentially 5 different moves that they can do, one of which essentially exercises undead, one of which causes somebody to be bewitched, which essentially just charms them to your side. One of them is a close range, high damage scaling shotgun move. Let's see, I believe one was silence, and the other one was an RT, which is recovery time reset, which essentially means it resets somebody's turn to the slowest that it can possibly be. Now, it's mostly that Bewitch move that I'd say the closest thing is the Orator, but they specialize in putting down barricades, specialize in firing guns, and on top of that they're able to just completely ignore terrain with one of their abilities. So, maybe a little bit of a stretch to say that those two are similar, but hey, it's there. Alright, next up we got the Beast Tamer. So this is what I'd probably say is most similar to something like the Thief, just in the kind of very vague vein that, well, they are, for all intents and purposes, they're able to poach animals. It's actually a feature in this game too. Apparently Mr. Matuno really loves being able to poach animals. Long story short, they're actually here to mostly support them, but they also get access to Tame and Subdue, which they can bring over to other classes, which allows them to recruit dragons and beasts. And essentially, once you recruit them, you can bring them to the store, sell their hides, that kind of thing. I mean, obviously, the other end of that would have been the rogue here, but that's a little bit too easy of a comparison, and that's assuming that I like to make sense of things. But yeah, the rogue here, he's specialized in just being fast and putting down traps, whereas this guy specializes in everything animal-related. So, alright, fair enough. Now, moving on, we have the Warlock. This is the other class that's able to throw items without the help of an additional item. And on top of that, I would say that this is basically everything else that was around from the all of the different mage classes that were available. Essentially, he's got the frontlining ability of somebody like, say, the Geomancer. He's essentially got the AoE casting abilities of something like the Black Mage. He's also got a pretty significant set of different buffs and debuffs from the other what could be considered the other classes as well. And yeah, essentially, you can have him do sword and board up front while going and throwing out debuffs. They have a move that allows them to push units around. Yeah, just overall a very fantastic unit for pretty much anything AoE related. Next up here we have the Necromancer, or as I like to call them, the Crossbowmancer. It's hard to say that this one has any variant, but essentially if you ever had a mage class that you wanted to equip crossbow on an FFT, that's basically this guy, except he specializes in zombies. That's about all there is to say in that one. He's got a bunch of special moves specifically dedicated to taking out zombies and or empowering them, depending on how you want to go ahead and play that. But alright. Next up we got the Lich. If I were to make a comparison, I would say it's as if somebody actually bothered trying to balance the calculator for this guy. He has access to almost every type of casting ability in the entire game, including a lot of the most powerful abilities. He has the ability to teleport. He has the ability to, well, if you end up using them right, to completely shut down and or wipe out entire groups of units, but he is phenomenally slow. So he's basically your walking super mage of a tank type situation. And alright, so we'll go ahead and put that there. So, next up we got the Angel Knight. I won't say that this has any direct actual comparison here, since this guy is basically an upgraded knight, and essentially requires a whole lot of hoops to jump through in order to get him. Specializes in removing zombies and removing mages. A little bit of an odd duck, but this is another guy, kind of like the Dragoon, that's been around since the very beginning for Tactics Ogre and Ogre Battle, so he's kind of a staple of the series, so he's got to be there. Next up, we got the Lord. This is most similar to Ramza as a Squire. He can equip just about any ability. He can equip just about any actual equipment in the game, and yeah, very freeform type of class. Stats aren't terribly impressive, but just the fact that he can learn and use just about anything makes him very open. We've basically from here on we've mostly got unique classes. We've got the Ranger here. Again, another one that doesn't really necessarily have an FFT equivalent, but he does have a D&D equivalent, if that's what you're thinking of there. But yeah, knives, bows, and guns for this guy. We've got the Priest. This is probably the closest one-to-one comparison for the White Mage. We've got the Princess here, kind of like a... I would argue in many ways very similar to the Holy Knight or something like that. The first thing that always comes to mind for the Princess here, yes, it's marked as Prince, don't worry about that. It's just because it's currently mousing over a male unit. But since this is her unique class, I would say the closest thing is the Holy Knight. Basically specializing as a frontliner caster type hybrid. Then we've got the Heretic here, who basically takes that same thing and brings it in a more magical direction, being one of the strongest casters in the game. Doesn't really have a direct comparison, but that is how it is. Next we got the Paladin. He's another Ogre Battle or TO type reference, so we'll go ahead and leave that as a staple of the series. Next up we got the Astromancer. Now, this may sound familiar to you because there is an Astromancer in FFT as well. So yes, you know exactly who I mean there, and he is meant to be exactly that guy. He actually is a unique class as well. He comes with the ability to use Galaxy Stop, and on top of that, the books in this game actually got redone so that they use the same kind of telekinetic attack, as it were. And on top of that, they end up making units weaker to magic. So it's just a fun little FFT reference on that one. If you're wondering what happened to the original vanilla game version of this class, don't worry, not a whole lot was missed. He was essentially just an overpowered caster with some skills that made absolutely no sense whatsoever. Don't worry about it. Alright, moving on, we got the Vartan. This is a semi-unique class available to Canopus. Actually, down the line, it will be exclusive to him. By the way, if you're wondering on a little bit of trivia behind all this, Canopus is actually a guy that you get a few battles in. Originally, he would have been more or less the equivalent of Thunder God Sid, but he's been brought down to a far more human level now, but he just has a class that specializes in all things harassment. He can basically regen himself, he can go and harass with a bow, he can have very high evasion, so essentially he can just regen all the little damage he ends up taking. Essentially just a very light harassment unit, very effective at what he does. But yeah, that's about all there is to say on that one. If you're wondering, by the way, the Vartan is actually an old Ogre Battle reference to Flash Gordon of all things, because, you know, they had to reference all things related to Queen in the series, and so at one point he apparently meets some, like, space bird people, and I believe their race is called the Bartons. So that's what the reference is there. How they never got sued is anyone's guess. Alright, next up we got the White Knight. I think this guy is a little bit of a mix between a Time Mage and a regular Knight. Basically specializes in, well, actually, not even that. If you take away all the Knight's abilities, just his basic ways to attack, so this guy specializes in doing a pretty decent amount of damage. I would say, actually, you know what, he's a mix of the Dragoon and Time Mage. Let's go ahead and go with that, because he gets access to a very similar moveset. You may be wondering why I didn't compare the two Dragoons that I was mentioning earlier, and that's mostly because this guy specializes in anti-monster stuff instead of jumping, although one thing I should have mentioned is that he actually did gain a FFT reference, and that he has the ability to ignore elevation with one of his abilities, so that allows him to move one tile over regardless of elevation. Anyhow, moving on to these guys, though. So yeah, I would argue that this guy is a mix of, like, the FFT Time Mage and the FFT Dragoon, in that he can use heavy spears and things like that, but at the same time, he has the ability to speed up all the units around him with one of his abilities, and has the ability to buff his accuracy strength, as well as giving himself an elemental buff with one of his free turns as well. Alright, next up we got the Shaman. This is probably closest in reality to something like the Geomancer. Basically just kind of your standard hippie mage. They have an ability to boost a particular element, and on top of that, they have the ability to change the weather around them. So, for example, if arrows are bothering you in that particular battle, you can just make it rain, so the rain itself will lower their accuracy, and on top of that, it has a chance to inflict an accuracy debuff on everybody on the opposite team. So that's potentially very strong right there. Next up, we got the Witch. It's exactly what I can't remember their name at the moment. There isn't really too much of an FFT one for this one. She's just basically a recurring character that always it's always just going around and messing with people, more or less. So I would say this is more of a staple of the series type situation. Next up, we got the Bard and/or Songstress, depending on who you're using for this. So the essentially this is exactly what it sounds like. It's a mix of the Bard and the Dancer. They've got some dance moves, they've got some singing moves, essentially specializing in buffs and debuffs. They don't hit everybody in the team, however they do essentially give a pretty wide area, so it's more of a localized version of both those classes mixed into one. Alright, next up we have the Buccaneer. I would probably say this guy is very similar to if you mix together, let's see, if you mix together Mustadio and Beowulf, I'd say. Now, why do I say those two in particular? All of his sword moves have a lot of debuffs on them, and he basically is a pistol and sword type of character for the most part. You can't have him specialize in either or really. You can just have him be a good swordsman, but personally, I just like going for the pistol and sword kind of piratey type situation. But that is how it is. I think that's all there really is to say about the Buccaneer here. There's only 3 characters that can become a Buccaneer. But either way, a little bit of a hard class to get, but a pretty fun one to use. Next up, we got the Knight Commander. This is probably the closest to Thunder God Sid, wherein this is a character that just basically specializes in doing obscene amounts of damage while being nigh unkillable. And that's about all there is to say on that. I mean, she's a character that can turn people to stone by just looking at them, basically use any manner of swords whatsoever, and can even double attack right off the bat, essentially allowing her to even do ridiculous things like dual-wielding spears. So she's absurdly strong, and yeah, she's the only character that can become a Knight Commander, and is ridiculously strong. Alright, next up, we got the Hoplite. Now, once we get into all the lizard classes, like the Hoplites, the Patriarch, the Juggernaut, this is when we start getting into more FFTA territory. For example, the Hoplite is closer to what would be essentially the Guardsman from FFTA. The Juggernaut is something similar to the Warrior from FFTA, the Bonga Warrior, I should say. The Patriarch is, well, similar to the Patriarch. You've got a few other ones here as well. I mean, arguably, Hoplite and Juggernaut also have bits and pieces of something like the Templar. So you've got those as well. Familiars, essentially kind of a mix between a trickster unit and a healer. Hard to really give a tie over for FFT on that one. And then on top of that, you've got all your other types of beast units out here as well. So there's a good number of things to choose from in this particular mod end game and all that sort of thing. So I hope this was useful to somebody. I will do more primers in the future if somebody's interested. And yeah, let me know what you'd like to see. I'd be glad to hear it. Have a good one, take care, and if you like this sort of thing, do that whole subscribe-y thing. Thank you, have a great day.